And we are back again with another episode of Record Live. We, Zanita and I, that is, your co-hosts of Record Live, will be on our best behavior today because we have our boss, Dr. Brad Kemp, and it's great to have you, Brad.
Yeah, good to be with you guys.
Now, Brad, before we get into today's topic, which is the General Conference session that's fast approaching, I think it starts at the end of next week. I thought we'd get to know you a little bit since this is your first time, I believe, on Record Live, or at least for some years, and while Zanita's been here. Tell us a little bit about yourself. We get the privilege of hearing some of your mission stories from Papua New Guinea every Wednesday worship time. We get a window into who Brad is, but tell us a bit about yourself and your career for the church and your interest in outside of work, perhaps.
Yeah, look, it could be a long or a short story, Jared. But when I finished at Avondale, I started in Perth, West Australia. So my wife and I was newly married at the time, started in some coastal churches, Fremantle and Rockingham, and then Mandurah. And we had a wonderful time there, and then we got asked to go to PNG. That threw us into a spin because we were enjoying life back where we were, but it was a life changer for us to go up and work in Papua New Guinea. And we started out in Goroka up in the highlands, had lots of wonderful experiences, met many wonderful people, and then from there to lay at the union office. And that's where I guess we got involved with governance, and we're going to be talking about governance to some degree today. And since then, I've worked at the division and union levels, doing various roles, mostly in governance, and today at Adventist Media. So the Lord's blessed. We've had a really rich experience in ministry in a whole range of areas. And here at Adventist Media, I work with some wonderful people like yourselves, and that's a great joy for me.
I was listening to you share a story the other week at worship, Brad, and I thought, and I said to Jared, why are we always scrambling for people on Record Live each Wednesday when Brad is just full of stories and full of life lessons? Like, we need to get him on regularly. And so I'm excited to have you on today. But today we're actually talking about something that's happening next week, the GC session, which I believe both of you are going to. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, I know this is something that everyone knows happens every 5 years, but I think a lot of people are sort of like, what actually goes on at these things? I think it's kind of something that few Adventists have the opportunity to go over to the States and participate in. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what goes on at the GC sessions?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff unofficial goes on, so lots of meeting and greeting and side meetings and so forth with different people. But the real business of a general conference session is to basically take stock of where the church has come from in the last 5 years, and to look at where do we want to go in the next 5, and what's the leadership team that we need to move the church in that direction. So that's probably the critical piece. So that's your election process. So you look at electing a general conference president, secretary, treasurer, the associates, departmentals, and also the division officers, president, secretary, treasurer. So they're the key pieces. There's also an executive committee that's elected at that time that serves the church at the general conference for the next 5 years. The other piece that happens is the church manual. So any changes to the church manual, which goes through a whole vetting process and hours of committees and backwards and forwards, but it finally comes to the floor of a general conference session where the church globally, so this is representatives from the church all over the world, decide on any changes that come into that particular document that guides the governance of a local church. So they're the key pieces that happen. There are some other things that take place with meetings of different boards and constitutional bodies that need to happen at that point. But they're the main things that occur at a general conference session.
Brad, tell us why you think it's important to have a church manual and some of those things. People might think, oh, we're just talking about policy and there's all these rules and different things in place. But what's the purpose of some of those things that this body looks at and examines and tweaks and adjusts?
Yeah, there's a reason that the church probably has 3 or 4 major documents that are important to keep the church together. So these are the kind of documents that as a united group we agree on as our rules of operating. So we have a church manual, which is really the church's rules of operating. It outlines, how the church is structured, how the church is led, how the church deals with issues, what the church does with money, etc. And so with a common agreed set of rules, we know from church to church that there's uniformity, that you don't have someone doing something entirely different and creating chaos over here, but that we're all working on a common playbook. So the church manual is important for the unity of the church. And so, that's why when you've got this manual, which is the universal playbook for a local church, or its rule book, the church comes together, has representatives from all around the world, and as a global body, we vote on any changes, any additions, any deletions, because that's what we're all going to follow for the next 5 years as the way we run church.
Forgive me if I'm wrong, Brad, but that sounds a little bit like the Bible, in terms of like a lot of the things I'm sure we're referencing to are in the Bible. Have we just kind of like taken things out of the Bible and used wisdom to like expand on these things, or are some of these things like modern issues that aren't mentioned that we've had to kind of discern as a church?
Yeah, it's probably the last bit. So while there are some principles that you find in the Bible on governance, and you can read about the early church in the book of Acts and some of the things it put in place for caring for the running of the local church. Church manual sort of takes that or those principles, and it looks at other things that we need to consider in today's age. So there are probably, it's probably a more distilled and refined set of guidelines or rules or operating principles for a local church than what you'd find in the Bible, because the Bible is more a story of God's activity with his people and how he's leading them through to the second coming of Christ. So, but in and around, you've got the stories, and out of the stories, you find the principles of how the church is to operate. So the manual's not the Bible. The church manual, is a very considered set of operating principles for a local church.
The elections are not quite, or the appointments are not quite what one might be familiar with, I guess, in a world setting. It's not like the most popular vote wins the presidency. So can you tell us a little bit about how Adventist church elections go? And do the GC appointments follow, I guess, what we might be familiar with in our own local church? Some of us might not be familiar how those appointments are made. So can you just tell us in a nutshell sort of how these decisions are arrived at?
Yeah, sure. It's probably not dissimilar to what we do in local church. At a local church, we have a selection committee. The selection committee selects the nominating committee, and the nominating committee then deliberates on the names or those who are to be appointed to certain positions. Now, it's a nominating committee, which means then they nominate, but the names come to the body of the church to actually vote on. And if they're not happy with the name or there's a reason, they can refer it back and there can be discussion around it. Now, what happens at the General Conference is very similar to that. The only difference is size. So in a nominating committee of the General Conference, you've actually got 300 people. You've got a delegation of about 3,000 people, 3,000 to represent, 23 million. So it's a representative democracy. But the process is very similar. So each of the divisions, they actually caucus, which means they get together before the nominating committee thing happens, and each division chooses. So the division actually serves as a mini selection committee for their division, and they will choose a certain number of people, which is set out in the constitution of the General Conference, who will serve as their members on the nominating committee of the General Conference. For our division, it is usually the 4 union presidents. And one of the reasons for that is because when you've got such a large world field, how are you going to know anybody? You've got 23 million people. You've got unions which are, in some cases, hundreds of thousands. In our division, our biggest union's Papua New Guinea. That's about 500,000 people, 500,000. Our smallest union is New Zealand Pacific. It's got about 12,000 people. So you can see the diversity. And the church has to work with all this mix and difference and come up with a system that works. And the system they use is each division has a certain number of people they can place on the nominating committee. They decide who they are, and then that nominating committee will meet. And they meet in a closed room away from all the activities for days on end, because they've got a lot of work to do. But then what happens is they start the nominating process by appointing a chairperson for the committee and secretaries. And then the very first position that is considered is the General Conference president. And once they make a decision on who they wish to bring before the body, the work of the nominating committee is stopped for a while. They go into the session, the name is presented to the body, and the body then has to decide on whether they're happy with that nomination, and they get to vote on it or to take whatever action is deemed appropriate. So that's the first thing that takes place. Once the president is voted, then they move on to the next officers of the General Conference. They'll look at the secretary, the treasurer or CFO, and the same process is followed. So each time key decisions are made, the names are brought to the body of the session, the 3,000 people representing the World Church, who then need to decide on that nomination. And so the process is worked through the week. And it's quite grueling. It's hours and hours and hours of prayer and work and discussion, and names going up, looking at what's in the best interest of the church, etc. So it is somewhat similar to a local church, just on a much grander scale.
I hope there's some exercise snacking breaks in there so you keep blood flowing to your brain. This is perhaps a question for both of you, because I've heard people kind of ask this before. Why is, even in the local church and on a GC level, why is it fashioned in that sense, that there's like a committee of people who, can have their say, but not like an election, I suppose, where you've got the people up for voting, and then everyone in the audience or everyone in the country or everyone in the church voting for their say? Why is there not a worldwide church involvement in that kind of voting process?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't know whether I know the answer to that one. Whether it's because it's what works. I'm just thinking, what would it be like to actually have ballot voting from 24 million or 23 million people on names of people nobody knows, you know. I think,
Yeah,
and
I guess
how would you actually manage that as a church?
It's true.
there'd certainly be logistical issues. I guess something that comes to my mind, Zanita, is the idea that that may turn it into a popularity contest. And I think the church system was developed to try to avoid the sort of politicking that you see in the outside world, because everyone's campaigning for votes. Then if you know you're going to be in a position to potentially be elected and running against, you know, 2 or 3 other candidates, it's sort of human nature leads you to try and, you know, wrestle or compete or find a way to win that vote, I guess. And this takes some of that competition out of it. That's my, I can't speak for those that set up the system, but that's sort of my feeling on what it helps to avoid is some of that competition.
Yeah, and it does do that to some degree. I don't think it's foolproof, Jared.
No, I don't think so.
There still can be, what would you call it? Not pressure groups, but influences that can come in.
Yes.
But generally, with a two-tiered approach, it does weed that out to some degree.
Brad, how many sessions have you attended, just out of interest?
Yeah, this will be number 5 for me. So 25 years worth. It's quite a hop.
What about you, Jared?
This will be my second. Last time I went to report for record. This time I'm being seconded by Adventist Review, so I'm going to do some writing for them and hopefully send some news back here as well.
Speaking of that, Jared, is there ways for people in whatever country they're from to kind of follow along with what's happening at GC? Like, are there live streams or summaries or, like you said, articles that are sent out?
My understanding is that there are. I didn't go to the last one, but I did tune into some of the meetings. I think that Adventist Review and Adventist Record and other outlets in your local area are going to probably report on and share a lot of content from the GC. There'll potentially be stuff generated. So if you're interested in, you know, what's happening, you should be able to get updates from your laptop or your phone right in the palm of your hand.
And Jared, the other exciting thing is the communication department of the General Conference have been working on a really ambitious plan of all the divisions working together on a grand communication plan. And so there's about in excess of 200 communicators all working together to put out hundreds of reports and articles across the session. And that'll come through the GC's communication website. Tracy will be there from Adventist Media, writing articles and directing traffic with all those hundreds of people. They're going to be produced in a variety of languages. So, we'll have someone from Germany writing something in German, which will be translated in English and made available to us. So we'll get a perspective from that part of the world on how the GC session is going and some of the decisions that are being made. And the same will be from someone from Japan, people from South America. So it'll be a real mix of people all working together, creating news, telling the stories, going onto the floor, interviewing people. You're going to get a real bird's eye view of what's taking place, and some of the stories behind the stories will come out as well, which I think will be quite interesting.
I don't know about your experience, Brad, what your sort of highlights are, but I guess one thing that stands out to me from the one session that I've attended is the mission reports and that sort of thing, some of the stories that come out. Tell us a little bit about some of the other things that happen apart from voting on policy.
Yeah, look, highlights at the GC session is the evening reports. So every evening, 2 divisions will give a report on what's happening in their part of the world to fulfill the mission of the church. So that's really, it gives you a really good insight into what they're doing to reach into their communities. And the interesting thing is that because you've got such diversity across the globe, what one division does and what works in their area will be completely different to what's happening somewhere else. So you look at places like the Inter-European Division and the Trans-European Division, which is very secular and Western, and the way they try and share Jesus and the gospel is very different to perhaps what happens in West Africa, where you've got a Muslim culture, or Southern Africa, or in Asia or South America. So you get to see not just the challenges that the church has, but the way they're trying to address those challenges to share Jesus in their part of the world. So that's an exciting part. The other piece that's probably the real finale, I guess, of a general conference session is called the Parade of Nations.
Cool.
And this is a really colourful event, because you've got all the nations of the world where we have a presence dressed in national costume and carrying their national flag. And there's always a number of nations where we have not entered yet, which are featured. So there are still, 8 to 10, I don't know how many it is, but somewhere around there, where we do not have an Adventist presence. And the challenge is always, how do we enter those territories in the next 5 years? But it's an exciting time. The other thing I find really interesting is on the Sabbath. So you have the Sabbath there, but you find a lot of people go to church in their national dress as well. And the really exciting thing is, you see the people from West Africa with all their colourful clothing, and it's just, I don't quite know how to put it, but it's a kaleidoscope of colour in many ways. And you see the church globally united with all its shades and colours and cultures, and it's just an exciting experience to be worshipping like that. There's a passage in Scripture in the book of Revelation that talks about the nations of the world coming together to worship God in the new earth. And this kind of event reminds me a little bit about that in a kind of snapshot or a microcosm. So they're sort of highlights of what takes place apart from the business.
Beautiful. It reminds me of the Olympics, the opening ceremony. Yeah. That's the closest thing I can picture, but it sounds super cool.
Exactly.
Brad, when I typically think of the GC session, I picture like a very formal gathering where people are kind of wearing suits and I guess voting on things and discussing things around big tables. Is there much of an atmosphere of I guess worship or prayer, or I don't know, even like fasting prior to all these big decisions? Like what's kind of like the spiritual emphasis that happens with these?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The day starts with a spiritual time. So there's always morning worship. There's always prayer seasons. A lot of time spent by the delegates in often, one-on-one, two-on-two prayer time. And then during the day, particularly at critical times where there's key decisions, the delegation will stop and they will have prayer and asking for or seeking God's guidance as we make some of those decisions. So they're very mindful of the need for God's guidance, and they're not at all shy about stopping a program if prayer is needed to just help us connect with God and his leading in the process. So yeah, it's quite a spiritual time. They also have some wonderful wonderful music from around the world, which aids the whole worship experience. And then they select, they find some really good speakers. When you've got a whole world to choose from, you think you could select some good ones, which they do. And it's very inspiring and very motivating, a lot of the sermons and presentations that are made during a general conference session. Now, I will say there is another piece that happens on the side of a general conference session, and that is the exhibition hall. Were you going to come to that, Jared?
I don't know. I think there'll be some stories there, so I'll probably wander through. But unlike last time, I probably won't be scheduled on the booth at any point. No shifts on the booth for me.
What is that? What is the exhibition hall?
Aha, I was waiting for that question. So what happens? So you've got the main venue where the delegates are meeting, and that holds a lot of people. But then adjacent to that is a hall where you've got lots of ministries and departments and divisions and institutions who set up a booth, and they're basically showing people either what they're doing, what they have to offer, what services or ministries they have, or what resources they have. And so the South Pacific Division has a booth, has a reasonably large one, and working together with Sanitarium, we actually attract a lot of people because food seems to work. I don't know why, but it seems to work. But at our booth, we share the story of what we're doing in the South Pacific to disciple people. And so there's screens and there's film clips rolling through which illustrate some of the things that we're doing in this part of the world. And every division has that. Every department of the General Conference sets up a booth to share what they've been doing and the resources they have to offer the world. And then you have some of the institutions like Andrews University, Loma Linda, Southern Adventist University, and some of the institutions talk about, some of the services and educational things they offer the church. And there's a whole range of ministries and supporting ministries that have booths there as well. So if you've ever been to, a Christian festival, particularly in the US, they always have these booths where they, share their ministries and what they're doing. So while the session is on and they're talking about church manual stuff, a lot of visitors say, we'll leave that to the delegates. We're going to go walking through the booths and see what exciting things are there. And often, they all have giveaways and you can get gifts of this, and you got little cards and tokens which you take in, and you give them a token and they'll give you something from their part of the world. So it's a little kind of side thing that happens, which isn't little but big.
And just on that, you said there's about 3,000 delegates, but tens of thousands of people come through some of those things. The Sabbath worship services and things like that are attended by people from all over. There's almost a bit of Adventist tourism going on to visit the biggest show in town for the weekend.
Do you know how many people are expected to be there this year?
They're expecting about 40,000 for the first Sabbath and 60 for the second.
Oh, okay.
That's a fair few people.
It's like a stadium worship service in the Sabbath morning. There's a whole stadium filled with people singing "We Are This Hope" together. It's quite an experience. Brad, we're running out of time rather quickly, but just to sum up, would you say there's a take-home message? It's like, okay, well, this is how the church works. We've learned a bit more about what happens at a session today, but someone who's listening or watching at home, maybe they're not attending or planning to attend. Maybe they're not even that interested in watching the live streams, the policy stuff. What should they be doing, or what could they do in the lead up to the session that's something practical that they can contribute or that they can take away from our conversation today?
Well, I think the first thing is that because this is the church trying to fulfill God's purpose, we need prayer. These are major decisions that the church makes, which guide the church for the next 5 years. And so the more we have people praying for what's happening and the process that's taking place at the General Conference session, I think the better. So that's the first thing I think anybody can do. I think, while there may be some who aren't interested, I'd still encourage you, if you get a chance, to dial in, have a look and see what's happening. Be familiar with what your church is doing at the global level. They're open meetings. You can see what's happening. You can see the discussion that's taking place. You can get an idea of some of the issues that the church is struggling with sometimes, some of the directions it's looking at. And, you talked about some of the mission things. There are lots of reports on where the church is wanting to go. There's a lot of talk around strategy and future direction. So how do we do this as a church, and what are the plans that we're trying to do globally? One of the huge challenges for the church is the 1040 window. And there are billions of people who live in the 1040 window who have never heard the name of Jesus Christ. So how do we reach that area? How do we be effective? Because that's part of the mission of the church. So there are discussions around some of these things. How do we as a church, how can we be effective in that part? There's lots of parts where we've been successful. We've just had P&G for Christ, huge success, but there are other parts of the world where we are hugely challenged still. So they're the things that the church grapples with. And at these GC sessions, there are reports around that, and there are discussions around that as well. So it's well worth coming in on YouTube or the platforms and listening to some of those discussions when they take place.
And prayer, that's something we can do whether we are coming with you guys or not. So would encourage everyone to be praying for the GC session as it starts. Brad and Jared, thank you for discussing the GC with us. Wish you both the best as you go. And Brad, we'll have to get you on again to tell some of your stories, but Jared, we'll see you soon.
Yeah, we could do a story time.
Yeah. Good.
Thanks,
All right.
Anita.
No problem. See you soon, everyone.
See ya.
Thanks. God bless.